And we're live. Good morning, good afternoon. It's dead on 12 noon today here in Beijing. Sorry, I'm not in Beijing, I'm in Guangzhou, but Beijing time. And Harold, who is a businessman in China, who's been here for quite a few years, is joining me because a few days ago I put a video out about IP theft. The European Union has basically come out and said, we are going to impose one condition on China. If China wants to build factories in Europe, they must transfer technology. And my opinion is that that's actually not a bad thing, because I don't like IP anyway. I don't like patents. But that's a different story. We'll probably cover something about that in a while. And Harold, you came to me and said, there's a lot more to this than meets the eye. Can we talk about it? So here we are talking about it. And welcome once again, because it's not your first time, to Jerry's Take on China. Welcome back, Harold in China.
Thanks. Great to be here, and thanks for having me. And yes, as you mentioned, there's so much to talk about when it comes to patents and IP theft and all these questions. So yeah, great to...
Should we start with the historical context? Because a lot of people said, China's getting what it deserves here. Let's go back to the historical context. Did China systemically, I mean, I'm not saying there hasn't been IP theft. I'm absolutely certain there would have been, and I said that in my video. But did China steal Western IP when it was developing, going back to the late 1970s, early 1980s, when factories were coming from the West and building these huge factories in China? Was China stealing their IP?
Well, I think we can already jump in my main point here, because the question is, who's China? Did China steal? I mean, this framing, and it makes sense. I mean, not blaming you, but it's exactly this kind of framing which actually confuses more than it clarifies, because obviously in the US, or if we talk about Europe, I'm from Switzerland, we would never say Europe stole something, or like when Europe colonized the world, Europe went around to steal. No, I mean, it was countries within Europe, and then it was which king or which endeavor, which the East India Company that colonized India and stuff like that. So when it comes to China, I think we really have to distinguish between various layers. And on one hand, there is the IP theft that clearly happened, which happened mostly from small and micro enterprises, and like the fake Rolex watches, the fake Gucci bags. They're very well known and very well acknowledged, and definitely that was theft. And design theft, it was like a high-tech patent, but these design thefts have happened a lot. But clearly, those aren't orchestrated by a communist party or the Chinese government. They are happening on a large scale in very small shops. And I would argue they don't hurt the owners of these designs, because in fact, they're rather free advertisement. They hardly ever sell to people who could afford a real bag of these brands. So they're not in competition with the actual brands, but rather they made the brand into status symbols, because people, all know them. Everybody knows these logos because they're on fake products. And, once people in China got rich, they started to want to buy the originals. So it was actually a huge advertisement success for these brands. But I'm getting off topic already. So yes, small theft, small scale, or in large numbers, I'd say that's something that did happen. At the same time, what you mentioned, the big factories that came, the car companies that invested in China, the chemical companies, they were not robbed of their IPs. They had clear contracts. And a very good example is also the high-speed railways for Europeans. That's a perhaps well-known topic. Siemens with the ICE from Germany, and the French, I think it's Bombardier is the company with TGV, exactly. These are the two high-speed railway producers that started in the 1980s, I think, in Europe. So quite early, they produced high-speed railway. And China really played them against each other, like said, like, how much do you want for building this line, these trains, plus giving us the IP on how it's built? And they just handled both of them down until they got a super price from each of them. And then they bought the IP and they bought the patents, they bought the technology, together with some small contracts, which for European companies were big contracts. But after a few years, the Chinese said, we don't need you anymore. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And now
so the line from Shanghai to Beijing, for example, which was one of the very first lines, was a very tiny contract in terms of the overall scope. But it was actually a massive contract for it. In fact, I think that was Japanese and French. I think I might be wrong with the Japanese.
Yeah. So the Japanese definitely, they were also very early on the high-speed railway.
They all did very well out of it, didn't they?
And that's another point, which is all these companies who sold technology for market access. That's the technical description to say, like, okay, they bought the market access so they can produce and sell in China, and in return they gave technology. And it's actually a well-known scheme that is also used with other developing nations in order to help them develop faster for the good of the people. All these companies did that with huge profits. They had huge revenues from these contracts, and they could and should have used them to keep innovating and getting better again. So that way they can keep being competitive. So yes, none of these companies got poor because they gave technology to China, and it wasn't a theft, back to your original question. And that was the big bulk of how China acquired Western technology. With another big bulk being acquiring outright Western companies. So, for example, in the car industry, brands like Rover are bought by Chinese car brands who just simply buy the entire company, or parts of it. Volvo, I think, is another famous brand that was bought by Chinese. And by buying the company, obviously, they also buy all the patents plus all the experts who work in that company. And so they get access to a lot of knowledge about technologies.
Yeah, Geely or Geely, depending on your pronunciation, but Geely is the Chinese correct way of saying it, I think. They bought Volvo in Sweden, and the owner of that company did an amazing thing. He bought a load of very highly paid executives from Sweden to China and based them in Chongqing. And he took a load of executives from Chongqing and sent them to Sweden. And the mutual learning and the mutual trust that developed between those companies, which were now one company, has been enormous. And at the time, I remember the joke in China was that if you bought a Volvo, you've just had it devalued because it's now a Chinese car. But if you bought a Geely, you've had it upped in value because it's now a Swedish car. And it's actually gone the other way around now. But that was the joke. I mean, it was more than 10 years ago when that happened. It was a bit of a joke.
And I think what's important to see is that Volvo is still a good brand and it's still popular. I think they're also a bit struggling with electric vehicles now, but overall, the Volvo is an upper middle class brand and is still very, very popular and still has good cars. Whereas, the Tata, which bought the Indian car maker Tata, which bought Jaguar, has not successfully maintained that brand. And just recently, Jaguar has made headlines with a very, let's say, odd ad that doesn't feature any cars, but a lot of very colorful people. And
it's not that. It's a little woke.
Leading to Elon Musk tweeting the question, where are the cars? Or do you sell cars? I think is what he tweeted.
Great question, actually. I was actually looking at a Jaguar yesterday. I'm in Guangzhou. This is a hotel room behind me here. And I'm in Guangzhou. And I went out with a group of people and we were following a car. And it was a Jaguar. And I looked at it and I thought to myself, has he bought a Chinese car and put a Jaguar badge on it? Because it actually looked like that. Really, as we were following it, I thought it was an Aeon, the one that they use for the taxis.
Right.
And it just looked very plain, very ordinary. And I'm a huge, all my life, I'm British. I've been a huge Jaguar fan all my life. And now I'm looking at this and thinking, it doesn't stand out. I mean, even had Chinese writing on the back. So they put some Chinese, this is what it made me think. It looked like it was like on the back of a Toyota made in Guangzhou or a Honda made in Guangzou, you see Guangzhou Honda, Guangzhou Toyota written in Chinese characters on the back. And I'm looking and going, what does that say? I read a few hundred characters, nothing more than that. But
Mm.
I'm looking at it saying, I don't know what it says, but it looks like he's taking the prancing or leaping Jaguar, put it on the back of a Chinese car, and that's what we're following. But when we got out, I had a look at it. It was a genuine Jaguar. All the other logos, etc., belonged where they should belong. But it just looked like an ordinary Chinese car to me. Or maybe Chinese cars are so good they look like Jaguars.
Well, I'd rather say that, yes. Well, actually, the both are not mutually exclusive, but recent Chinese cars do look fantastic. I think there are some really good brands in China. And again, they also profit a lot from Western designers. They have not stolen designs, but rather bought the chief designers of famous brands who now work for Chinese brands because they get more liberties, they get more salary, I bet. But also they get more decision rights as the foreign expert with a really strong proven track record of designing good cars. They're treated like superstars, and they get to say what Chinese cars should do to look really good. And they don't have to fight with, the internal combustion engine department. Like I worked at VW for a while, and that was always the strongest department, and the designers were trying to get the engineers to, modernize a little bit in order to keep up with Chinese pace. But it was always a very strong, big struggle for designers, where I think, if you work as a superstar, high level designer for a Chinese brand, you really get a lot of attention and a lot of liberties.
Yeah, the Xiaomi SU7 is a great example, I think. It just looks like a Porsche to me.
Yeah, it does look,
but it's not.
I think the outside shape is the same dimension as a Porsche, but anyway, I think we're kind of drifting away from the original topic that I've wanted to talk about.
Let's go back to IP. Okay, do you think what the European Union has suggested, because it's not written into law yet, it's purely a suggestion that China will need to transfer technology. Do you think it's a good or a bad thing?
So I think it's probably justified or fair in certain areas where China really is world leader now. I don't think it's a necessarily completely bad thing. It's a bit weird because the EU is not a developing nation or block of developing nations. Usually this mechanism is reserved for developing nations so they can catch up with the former colonizers. Now the EU is kind of saying, well, we're behind China, so now we use the same tools that were used to help colonized countries catch up, although China never actually colonized Europe. So in terms of fairness, I don't think it's really in that sense fair historically, but in terms of justification, I'd say why not? I would warn Europe, though, that China does not need Europe as much as you may think they do. So they may just choose to not go to Europe if that's the conditions that Europe imposes. But what I think is really important is really the mindset, the framing of people. I think too many people, when they look at these global industrial policies, they identify in a purely nationalistic lens. And they say, okay, this is a European company, this is an American company, and the Chinese stole from us. Now think about that. If you're an employee in a big company, or if you're not even working for a big company, but just a regular worker in Europe or the US, what patents do you own? Me personally, I have a nice salary, but I've never owned any patents. So from that start, nobody can steal my patents because I don't have any. And so to go then and say, okay, but the Chinese stole our technology. Well, it's not ours. It was never mine. So they never stole from you the technology. Who did they steal it from? From the big corporations that you and I know that they exploit us workers, the big companies that look to maximize the wealth of the investors while minimizing the wages of the workers, while maximizing the prices of the products that we buy. So be it as a consumer or as an employee, they really want to take as much from you as they can and give as little as they can. And those are the ones who own those patents. So you could equally just frame it as a Robin Hood story where, they steal. Let's just say they stole, even though we just discussed that point. But let's say the Chinese stole from the Western companies a lot of technology. Well, isn't that a Robin Hood story where the poor people in China, because at the time they were really poor and still now have a lot of poor people in China, the poor people from China steal from the rich conglomerates in the West. And what do they do when they acquire this technology? They produce these products in very large quantities and at much lower prices than the Western companies. So it's literally the Robin Hood part of giving it to the poor, right? So they steal from the rich, they take technology, they produce cheaper goods that they sell to the poor in China, but also to the poor around the world, because a lot of developing countries can afford Chinese products where they couldn't afford Western products before. And they even sell it back to us if our governments allow that, and give us cheaper alternatives to what our companies produced. So it's really a win for the working class people if China succeeds in acquiring technology from capitalist large conglomerates and then manages to produce much cheaper products with it. And
there is one more thing I can add to what you've just said, and that is this. About 20 years ago, a little less, because I'd been here probably a year, about 19, 18 years ago, I met with a fairly wealthy guy. He became my student. It was a private student. I was teaching him and his wife English, and he wanted to buy a Mercedes-Benz. And he was a pretty wealthy guy. And I asked what model he was going to get, and he mentioned the model. I said, I've never heard of that one. And he said, oh, it's an imported model. You can only buy it imported. You can't buy it in China. And I said, well, why would you do that? And he said, because the ones that are made in China, and there are Mercedes made in China, the ones that are made here are the old versions. So in other words, what they were doing on this technology transfer scam that everybody in the West seems to think China was up to, was they were only giving China old stuff. And this actually bears out some things. You find there's a range of bicycles, and you would have seen them, that look just like the old Rayleigh bicycles from when I was young. I'm 66 years old. And when I was young, we used to have these sit up and beg handlebars. And those things are still to this day made in China in that old style. So that technology has been transferred to China, but it's only transferred after it's no longer cutting edge, leading edge technology. And I think that's probably the thing that this Mercedes deal, and I didn't think about this at the time, they weren't giving us cutting edge technology. They weren't giving us the IP that was really useful to them anymore. They were keeping that for their own productions in Germany, which is fair enough. And they were sending across stuff that, pretty much it was open source now because everybody's seen it. And if not open source, it could be easily copied. And they knew that. They kind of knew exactly what they were up to. I think that was the big thing that China can now do. So China can open a cutting edge factory today in it won't be in Lithuania, but somewhere in Europe, and it might be Lithuania if they do the right thing, but that's a different story. But it could be somewhere in Europe, like Serbia or Hungary. They open a cutting edge factory today, but it's not cutting edge by the time it's operating and shipping cars. It's kind of a year out of date, and that's why the cutting edge IP thing is not such a big deal to me.
Sure. Yes, definitely. And I think that's definitely fair also if companies do it that way. Why not? But again, I think the main point that I'm raising, and obviously that's a Marxist, if you will, communist, if you will, point of view, is to not identify with the country of the people who exploit you, but rather identify with the people that you are a part of, which is we are working class, whether we work in Europe or in the US or in China, and patents are owned by big corporations, and look at what they do with it. And now there is one argument that I think is fair in opposition to such an argument, which is, well, those big companies, they have these patents and they give us the jobs that pay well in Europe. And if Chinese companies steal or acquire the technology, then these jobs all go to China, and then we are unemployed. And so it does hurt us directly. And there is some merit to that point, But in this concrete example of China, it's obviously not the Chinese who stole our jobs. It's again those companies that, this person that I'm referring to would be defending. So you defend the VW, you defend the Gucci, you defend, the big Western corporations, but it's them who actually moved all those jobs to China. It's not China that forced them at gunpoint to move jobs to China. It's that China offered cheap workers with lower salaries and relatively good education. And it was those capitalists who did not care about your country, who did not care about them being Americans or Europeans. They moved to wherever it was cheapest to produce, but you didn't feel much of it because they didn't go down with their sales prices. They did go down maybe a little bit, but they didn't really go down much. And we can actually see that very clearly in financial statements. Maybe people have seen I think there was a famous one with like shoes, Nike or Adidas shoes. How many percent of the end sales price goes to which part of the value chain?
Mm-hmm.
And all the parts that were produced up to in China, like the cotton farmers, the plastic, etc. All those steps, they make up like 10%. And then the design, the brand, the marketing, these are the parts that make up 80, 90% of the profits. So again, that's profits which go to the capitalist owners of the companies, whereas the workers who actually made the shoe, they get like 10% of the value of the shoe. So it's capitalist countries, companies, it's capitalist owners who moved the jobs away from you. And you identify with them and you say, oh, the poor ones, they got robbed of their technological edge. I don't think that's the smart framing of a worker to do. So it's again the question, why do we always tend to identify with the country or the region we come from rather than the type of people that we actually are?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've never thought about it like that because I never identified as a socialist. I find myself leaning towards socialism, but I call myself a socialist with Chinese characteristics because I honestly see that it does work. It works very, very well. I'm enough of a capitalist to want to have enough money in the bank to save for my retirement and all the other things. I wouldn't mind being rich. I never will be unless I win the lottery, which I don't even do. So, I've got no chance of becoming a rich guy. But I hope I'll always have enough money in the bank to live comfortably. And that's the kind of capitalist in me, rather than have the state look after me and care for me. And that's the socialist in me. So I've got a bit of both of those inside of me. And you made a really interesting point there, where we shouldn't be identifying as Chinese or American or whatever country we come from. We should be identifying as working class, or we should be identifying as capitalist.
Right. And I also want to, I don't want to say people should all be socialists. I understand in recent developments in the Western political world, I'm probably much closer to a lot of so-called right-wingers than to the established left, the social democratic workers, labor in the UK, or like the Democratic Party in the US. I don't even recognize them as left-wing. So I think it's very difficult to use the labels nowadays because they've become so convoluted. When a social democratic party in Switzerland as well, they've recently decided to give up the goal to overcome capitalism. And then you're like, well, what's socialist about you anymore? If you commit to capitalism, then you're not a socialist party anymore. That's just...
that was the argument that Deng Xiaoping had when he was trying to open and reform. And he came up against a hell of a lot of backlash from that, people wanting the old Mao way of keeping it socialist. And he's saying, well, no, we need to get some capitalist principles, because if one person gets rich and he helps others, trickle down economics. If one person gets rich and helps others, that will be very useful to our country, because everybody can move up.
Yes,
allowing some people to move up more.
I want to interject there, though, like two very important points. Deng never said he wanted to introduce capitalism or end socialism. He said, in order to save socialism, we need to have markets. And he said, look, capitalist countries have some parts of their economy planned. They're still capitalists. So why can we as a socialist country not have some parts of the resource allocation by markets? So not all planning is capitalist and not all markets, not all planning is socialist, not all markets are capitalist. That's what Deng said. So he never said, let's give up socialism and move to capitalism. No. On the contrary, he said, we need to allow some people to get rich, but he didn't believe in the trickle-down economics, because the trickle-down economics is like this misunderstood Adam Smith kind of believe in God, somehow the wealth will come to everybody. And that's exactly not what happens. So Deng Xiaoping said, yes, let some get rich first. And the second part of the sentence is, so they can take the others along with them. But that wasn't something that was, like metaphysical, that somehow this will happen. That was a very clear warning and threat to those who get rich first, which is if you bring the rest along, then you're not going to stay rich in China. Yeah. And for some time, that meant that a lot of millionaires and billionaires would just leave China, take their money away. And I think this is what Xi Jinping is correcting now. He's saying, like, look, you were allowed to get rich based on the hard labor of the Chinese people, based on the resources that we as a government provided, including, the great infrastructure, the education to the people, to the workers that you build your companies on. You were allowed to get rich, but now you have to bring this country forward. And if you don't do that, you don't have any privileges just because you're rich, because the reason you're rich is that this country, this society has allowed you to get rich. And if you acknowledge that, then very much you're recognized as somebody with skills, with management abilities. It's a proof that you're able to distribute resources in a way that creates additional value. But it's not something that you have done because you're so amazing. Nobody gets rich on their own. People get rich by organizing a lot of people and resources.
Yeah, I think a great example of that would be Huawei. Where I think Huawei has 127,000 owners. It's not a publicly listed company. If you want to have shares in Huawei, you've got to work there 10 years. And if you want to keep your shares, you've got to work there 10 years more, something like that. But then a lot of people are retiring.
Exactly. On the other hand, it's not a family business. It's not just owned by the owners. It's owned by the employees. Exactly. I think that's an excellent example. And the other example, the negative example, is of course Jack Ma, who built a great online platform inspired, let's say, by Western online concepts. And he built that for China and got extremely rich. And then he ventured into banking and financing. And again, smart move to say, look, we have a lot of user data from people who buy stuff on our platform. So we know how much money they spend every month. So we have an idea about their ability to repay loans. But then his idea was, okay, we give out the loans, we get the interest payments. And if the loans fail, it's actually a loan given by the bank. We're just the intermediary who finds the borrowers and gives them to the bank. And for that, we get a fee in the middle. But if the loan fails after all, then it's the bank who takes the risk. And so he proposed basically a system where the state-owned banks, where the government takes the whole risk, whereas the profits go to his company, which then again is a company owned to some part by investors on the stock market, by American capitalists. And that's where then the Communist Party said, like, no, this goes too far. You're shoveling profits from the Chinese people to American investors, and the risk is outsourced to the Chinese government. And that's exactly the kind of scheme that is very unpopular. And I find it rightly so. And again, if I was a Chinese, I would not identify with Jack Ma and be like, oh, this poor entrepreneur who got wrecked by this oppressive Communist Party, but rather, I'd be like, well, great that at least here, these kind of schemes to outsource the risk to the public while privatizing the profit, this scheme is not allowed in China. And that's a good thing for everyone.
Yes, so if anyone's interested in looking into that, Ant Finance was the name of the organization. It was just days away. It was very, very close to an IPO when the government pulled the rug out and said, no, we've looked at this and this is wrong. And I think you've just given a very accurate description. They were taking all of the profit and outsourcing the risk, and outsourcing the risk to their own government, which is why it had to stop. Now, the same thing has already happened many times in the United States, and that's where unfettered capitalism takes over. And unfettered capitalism allows exactly that. It doesn't matter who gets the risk as long as we get the profit. And consequently, another example inside of China was Evergrande. Evergrande was doing exactly the same thing, as was Country Garden. It's a slightly different way. Evergrande was on the US Stock Exchange, New York Stock Exchange. Country Garden was issuing international bonds, debt bonds. So people overseas were investing in properties here that were unbuilt. So when they were building them, the price was already escalating because they were all sold. They were sold off the plan, many of them to American investors, not always American, but a lot of American investors, and many of them to overseas capital. And the overseas capital was picking up 15, 20, 25% profit. And then Ma and Pa go to buy a new apartment. It's already 20% more expensive than it needed to be. So that's exactly what did happen. So we can see there China saying, well, we're not capitalist. We're not going to allow unfettered capitalism. And that's probably the reason. So did China steal American jobs?
Yes. So as I think we should really see it is it was Western capitalist owners, and I don't mean the small shop owner, the small enterprise with 20 employees. I mean really the big corporations that moved jobs to China. Now, of course, if you're an unemployed person in a Western country, it doesn't help you much. Like, should I frame it evil China or should I frame it evil capitalist? I'm still unemployed. So I'm aware that all these points that I've been making are somewhat theoretical. But I think this theoretical framing is very important if we ask for solutions. Because if we frame it as a war between nations, you'd say like a nationalistic framing, then the solution obviously is let's all stand together in Western countries and fight the evil Chinese. Let's increase tariffs. Let's sanction the Chinese. Let's try to contain China. And that's exactly what Western politicians are aiming for, because for the Western capitalists, that is obviously the best possible outcome, to have the whole exploited working class of the West stand behind them and do whatever they say in order to fight a perceived foreign threat from another country. However, if we frame it as the question of working class being exploited by huge conglomerates, then the question becomes, what can be done? And now I'm sitting here in China and I say, yes, obviously China has some very rich people. It has some large conglomerations. It has all its flaws. But it does have a communist party that is in power, and they have a very strong ideological framework that is for the working class. Now, obviously, the Chinese working class is still a lot poorer than the European and American working class, so they're not going to shed tears for the whining of a European worker who earns a bit less than they used to 10 years ago, because it's still a lot more than the Chinese. But what I do see China actively do is invest in infrastructure around the world, and that's really outside Europe and the US, invest in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Africa. And again, all these projects, there's always some flaws in them and there's always some problems that you can focus on. But if you focus on the big picture, these projects really increase the incomes of people in developing countries. So I think the Chinese Communist Party is mostly responsible to improve the lives of the working class of China. But they are thinking globally, and they are realizing that if the workers around the world are better off, then that's good for China. It makes the world more peaceful. It gives them more trading partners. So they do have an interest to see the whole world become more prosperous.
Why do you think the Americans don't see the same thing?
Because the American capitalist system is built on the extraction of resources from other places. So the American focus is not to have as many customers as possible. The American focus has always been to make sure that the owners of the big corporations get access to the resources that are underneath the earth of other countries. And now in like with development of modern economics, another resource source is cheap labor. So they are happy if other countries stay poor, as long as they're not too much in war. As long as they're safe to produce, it's great to have poor people because they're willing to work for much lower salaries than people who already have a certain level of wealth. And at another point, again, the nationalist framing of the world, the US wants to prevent any other country to become a great from becoming a great power that challenges their position. So they'd rather have, a small cake of which they get all of it, rather than have a globally big cake, but with the risk that somebody else also has a big piece of that cake. And I think that's in a very like big picture framing. I think that's what's happening in the US.
Yeah. Black Sun has just said the word is exploit, which I think is probably right. I look at things like the situation in, let's, for example, say Syria at the moment, or Libya at the moment. These were countries that were relatively rich and are now kind of embroiled in wars that didn't really need to happen. Democracy needs to be brought to these people at the point of a gun, then it's not democracy, in my opinion. So that's
was it brought to them. Nor was it brought to them, the fact. To look at Libya now. I mean, they were definitely far better off before.
And if they were better off, I mean, let's take for an example Zambia in Africa. Zambia is a country that is developing. It's developing with Chinese aid, Chinese help. And I've got a friend who's in Zambia, which is why I know a little bit about it. And in fact, he's not in there now. He's back in Australia, but he was in Zambia a while ago. Sends me pictures of Zambia. Rows and rows and rows of Chinese factories, one after the other. Chinese investment is massive in Zambia, massive. And basically what's happening there is those Chinese workers, or workers in those Chinese factories, are all Zambians. There might be a few managers and a few specialists who come from China to do something there. But they're basically 99% Zambian workers who get Chinese kind of salaries. They're a little better than the local salaries. They get conditions that Chinese government insists upon. They get annual leave. They get days off. They get maternity leave. They get holidays. They get social security. And people want to work in these factories. Now, those people then create the next market, because if you're building cars in a factory in Zambia, who are you going to sell those cars to? The people who can afford it, not the people who couldn't afford it. And therefore, you've just invested in your own business, which seems to me to be the opposite of what America wants to do. It says, we've got enough money here in our circulation that we want to invest in Zambia, but we want to exploit whatever resources they got, take them away, and leave them with nothing. So one way or another, it doesn't seem to work.
Yes, and also I think a big question is, what do you put in your focus of international politics? Is it the well-being of humans? In that case, the Chinese model absolutely makes sense, because the higher the incomes of people, the better they are. Zambia is never going to be a huge relevant market compared to the 1.4 billion people living in China. So it's not going to be in itself a big thing, nor was Libya. And for the American perspective, exactly the same thing. Like, do I rather get access for my companies to oil in Libya, or do I help them become rich so they can buy our products? Obviously, Libya is, compared to the US, still a very small country, and the market is not that important. So if you're extremely cynical and really don't care about people dying and suffering, then you can say, well, I'd rather destroy the country so I get access to the oil there. And in some respect, I don't think, I'm definitely not going to claim all Americans, not even all American politicians, are that cynical, nor do I claim all Chinese politicians are that humanitarian. Obviously, also not common people in China. A lot of people in China as well, they rather just look at economic factors, world politics factors. African countries have many seats in the United Nations. As long as China and the world still cares about the United Nations, it's good to have friends in those countries. But I think really this Marxist theoretical framework that all Chinese politicians are constantly exposed to. You have to study Marx in order to advance in Chinese politics and in the Chinese Communist Party. They really do make you start looking at the world from the perspective of the working people. And another point I think is a huge misunderstanding when the word communism comes up. Many people imagine communism means the government gives everything to you. Like the original idea of communism in Marxist theory is the opposite. It's the working class emancipates. The working class stops taking order from the bosses, from the kings at that time, and from the factory owners. The working class takes things in their own hands. And again, that's interestingly enough where I see a similarity to the kind of libertarian anarcho MAGA US, where, you know, very much from a right-wing framing, people start saying, well, we should stop just obeying these big corporations. We should question all of what they say. They've captured our government. We should take things in our own hands. And that was exactly the Marxist message. You know, the workers are the ones who produce things, so they should be able to control who gets those things. It doesn't make sense that workers produce everything, but then cannot afford to buy it themselves. And so also in Africa right now, when Chinese invest, they give jobs to African workers. It's then up to the African workers to make use of this opportunity. They cannot just hope that China is so generous that they will eventually give them better careers, higher salaries, make them managers. No, they have to work hard for that. And the Chinese never complained when Western companies came. They never said, why don't you give me a manager position? You know, they started to work hard. They started to learn how to do things. And either they progressed in the Western companies, or they just left and built their own competitors to the Western companies.
Well.
So it's, yeah, exactly. So it's not about waiting for the generous communists to give you things. It means take the opportunity to work with them. And here's the thing that is, I guess, my biggest message to European and American working class people who worry about China taking the jobs, being better in technology, you know, taking over the world. Economically speaking, China is doing that, not in a colonial way, not at gunpoint, but really just by being better, cheaper, more productive. That's what the Chinese are doing. And here's my question. If you are worried about that, assume you're really an ideological Chinese communist who wants to stand with the working class in the West. Who do you go to talk to? You cannot talk to Western governments. You cannot go to talk to the EU, elites. You cannot talk to the company owners. Well, who do you talk to?
It's a very interesting question. You raised a point during that, which I've covered in a couple of videos earlier on about the MAGA situation. And it's the most interesting thing to me. I think this is fascinating that MAGA, which we consider to be extreme right, is developing policies that are extreme left. And I talked to Haz al-Din, who is the guy who has created the phrase MAGA communism, which to me sounds like an oxymoron. It's one of those words that is two words totally contradictory. But he says, no, they're not contradictory at all. If you stop framing things as left and right and start framing things as just this is the best way of doing things. And the more he talks, the more sense he makes. It is kind of like socialism with Chinese characteristics. MAGA communism is right-wing with left characteristics. And it actually really does make sense.
Well, yes. I also think the MAGA communist movement is one of the most interesting political movements in my lifetime in the last 30, 40 years in the Western world. Because they have this spirit of building something, not just destroying. You know, in the 90s, you had like the chaos days and like this anarchist movement and the anti-globalist protests from the left. But they weren't a constructive left that actually wanted to build an organized society. They just wanted to destroy the Western society. And in terms of like in this whole anarchy, I see the ideals originally were left-wing in sense of everybody's equal and everybody's free, etc. But they've now moved away from being political at all. They're just destructive. It's just like nobody should lead anything and nobody should organize anything. And that's just not how humanity works.
Not how anything works.
Yeah, the idea that the only thing left is anti-hierarchy. That's not how I understood any left-wing or right-wing theory. Yes, left-wing is against inherited hierarchy. It, like being born son of the king, so you're the next king. That's definitely against the left-wing ideology of people being equal. But even equal people need to organize. And when you organize, it means that in certain aspects, somebody has to say more than another person, because otherwise you're not organized. But in an egalitarian sense, I'm still equal in value to my boss. So my boss says where things go when it's about the fate, like the fate of our company, when it's about strategic decisions where to go. But when we're outside, and I'm driving a car and I have a green light, just because he or she is my boss doesn't mean that she gets to drive ahead of me with crossing a red light. So we're equal in that sense in society, but within a certain role, there can obviously still be very much differences in hierarchy.
Yeah.
But back to the Maga communism, I totally agree. If we think about the evolution of humanity and the development, I mean, that's the whole point of Marx, is to say that capitalism was a very, very positive and important step in the development of humankind compared to feudalism. But at one point, the capitalist direction is that companies become bigger and bigger, and by being bigger, they will be able to gobble up more of the markets. So in the end, they end up owning the whole markets. And at that point, the economy by natural process becomes a planned economy, because within the company, within the conglomerates, of course, things are planned. They don't happen in free markets. And so that planning takes over more and more share of the entire economy. And if you look at a big industrial conglomerate, there's huge parts of planned economy happening inside the company. They sell then a product on a free market or on a not so free market, but inside the company is all planned. And so from that point, at one point, this planning should be led by the working people so that it benefits all people and not just a small class of owners of companies. And if we think towards further automation of the economy, when the whole economy is basically self-driving, self-producing, then you don't need workers anymore. And at that point, we really need some planning for society to say what should be produced and who is it given to. Because if all the revenues from a fully automated value chain goes to the owner of that value chain, that means 80, 90% of humans have no income anymore because they're not needed as workers anymore. So at that point, you need to come to a socialist system or to a system that plans the allocation of resources in some way. And if you want to make America great again, you also need to realize that the path forward at some point is to holistically for the whole society plan what should be produced, how much should be produced, and who is it given to. Now, you still need incentive mechanisms. You still need ways for humans to show their abilities and their strengths, because that's something that humans crave, and that should get rewarded, because otherwise everybody becomes lazy, and that's not good for society, but it's not even good for the lazy person, because you feel better if you do a lot and you get a reward for the efforts that you put in. The question is just, how will that happen? And that's kind of the question that if we look in the long-term future, 20, 30, 40 years from now, we need to think about what should be the incentives that people are diligent and what should they get in reward for it, because most of the production will be automated. And so if you want to make any country or region great again, you need, or again, drop the again, actually, if you want to make those countries, places great for the people to live in, you need to move towards a socialist system. And I think in that sense, I totally agree with the Maga communist movement. And I've heard very interesting, interviews with people who are staunch right-wingers and say, yeah, I'm right-wing, I'm against these big corporations controlling our government, I'm for worker-owned companies that, the shares are given to the employees. And then you're like, okay, ignore the right wing. That's a person that I want to work with, because that's a person who gets it.
Yeah, it is kind of a dichotomy, but it's a genuine feeling. I put this comment up a little while ago because somebody made it debt control, not investment, and the same person made a comment a little while later on, and it indicates to me that they felt that China's system of lending money or investing in say African countries or Middle Eastern, not Middle Eastern so much, but definitely Latin American countries was a kind of debt control. What's been said, and I think it was a prince from Saudi Arabia who said this, every time China invests in your country, you have a bridge, a train line, a freeway, you have a building, a hospital, schools, universities, you have a port, whatever it is you have. When China leaves, you still have that. When the West come and they invest in your uranium, they take away all of your uranium and then they leave when it's gone and you have nothing left. That's the difference between Chinese investments, Western investments. And for anybody who's thinking, oh, but China does control through debt, read Deborah Broughtingham. She's written lots of stuff, and she's specifically about Africa, but she's an American professor, and she has written about the debt trap myth, which it is a myth. So anyway, I just thought I'd put that one in there. And we're coming up to 50 minutes. And I know that you're at work and probably on your lunch break, so I won't keep you too much longer. Tariffs. I just wanted to hit this magic word, tariffs. Are they, because in America, we keep getting told these are going to reduce global inflation. They're going to help America to reshore, onshore, backshore, whatever it's called, Frenchshore. Tariffs. What's your opinion on them?
Okay. So they will reduce inflation. That's just how, like by adding taxes, because tariffs are a form of tax. We have to be very clear about that. By adding taxes, you usually don't reduce inflation. So that's just weird. I'm not completely opposed to tariffs. I think there is a case made for local production for certain things, but they have to go hand in hand with strong investment into the industries that get protected. So tariffs are a form of protectionism. They will, shield your country, your region, your market from external competition. But if you don't combine that with heavy investment into that industry, like really state-led, strong resources put into the education of experts, the infrastructure around it, the clusters to really build world-leading companies, that if you don't do those things, then what tariffs will lead to is, like a protected field where your outdated technology, your inefficient companies can continue to exist and sell to your own population because the much better competition is too expensive thanks to the tariffs, which in the long term will just mean your companies stay complacent, they will fall further and further behind. And at one point, you have to increase the tariffs ever more because the competition is just so much better. And in the long term, you end up kind of what happened to the Soviet Union. They were closed from foreign competition, and they ended up being just not competitive anymore in many products, in many fields of technology. And that's where I see the West going at the moment, because they don't have real economic policies to show a pathway how they want to keep being competitive.
I see it as a slightly different, very similar thing to you. It can't help. I don't know how it can help inflation. I can't see that at all.
Inflation, no.
You put more money onto something, it can't bring the prices down anywhere in the world. But I see it slightly differently. For example, if a Tesla in the United States, I don't know what they cost now, let's just say they cost $50,000. And if a BYD, which matches the Tesla specification, costs $35,000, and then you put tariffs on it to make it $70,000, what's Tesla going to do? Is Tesla going to remain at $50,000, or is Tesla going to go up to $60,000 in order to say, well, we're still 10 grand cheaper than the import, which is the same standard of car? I'm not talking about a BYD seal against a Model Y. I'm talking about a comparable level of cars where Tesla is more expensive. Apple phones are much more expensive. The new Mate 70, which was just launched, I think, yesterday.
Right.
What day is it today? Thursday or Wednesday? It was Tuesday it was launched.
Yeah, yesterday.
Yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly my point of complacency. If you protect the company but don't force them and help them to become competitive again, then they will become complacent and just say thanks for the additional revenues at the cost of the working class and consumers. By the way, getting back to that topic, yes, the owners of those companies will get very rich from the tariffs, but you won't.
And it'll be short-term rich as well, because eventually people will realize that this Chinese car's got better. You know, it may be the same now, but it's going to get better, and Tesla won't. Tesla might, but it may not.
Well. No, but it's a theoretical exercise, and that's exactly the point. The tariffs, they protect the local companies, and that can help to transition towards being more competitive. But if you don't push the companies to do that, then you just protect them even though they're not able to catch up, and that's definitely long term a big problem.
Yeah, I think so too. So the tariffs don't seem to be the right answer. The tech transfer would. Last question to you, because I know we're getting near that hour of your lunch break, and you need to go and have a nap, right?
Yeah,
because this is China. The last question: do you think, in your opinion, would China say, yes, this is fair enough, we will transfer our technology to you? Or do you think they'll just say, oh, no, we can build the same thing in Tanzania, and we've got a Dar es Salaam port out there that we can use, and we don't need Europe anymore? Which way do you think that would go?
Well, again, it's not China that builds factories, right? It's companies. And I think we need to look at which industry, which company, they make decisions based on market relevance. Indeed, the European market may not be as relevant as Europeans think it is. So if BYD can sell to South America and Southeast Asia, they have a much larger consumer base there than Europe will ever provide. If, like a NIO or like a more upscale brand of Chinese car company looks for consumers, they may think, well, Europeans do have a lot of money to spend on cars, so maybe it's more important for them. So in that respect, I think that's the first thing. It depends on the company's strategy and direction if it's worth for them to do it. And then when it comes to like core technologies where China has said we have a national strategy that we want to become a world leader, there's obviously the possibility that China is going to encourage or enforce companies not to share that technology with Europe, which is the same that the US does with European companies. Funny enough, it's the US that doesn't allow European companies to sell to Chinese because they want to keep the tech outside of China. They can do things like that, but we'll have to see. I think with core technologies that are world leading, I don't think China will share them with Europe right now. I don't think they have to. It's just not important enough compared to the other market options that they have.
I'm inclined to agree with you. And many people in the US think their freedom is under threat from things like Medicare for all. I can't see how Medicare for all is a threat to anyone. Even the ultra rich will still pay for their medical treatment. Medicare for all is not really for all. It's for the people who can't afford medical care. But that's an interesting point to come up with. But Kevin put that on there.
I think that there's several layers which I also don't understand. I mean, the first is to offer a healthcare for everybody that you're just covered by law and automatically, like the British system, where you just as living in Britain, you have a right to free medic. How does that reduce your freedom if you don't have to pay for something that you can get? I mean, that in the first place doesn't make sense. Now,
and if you can afford it, you can go privately. It's as simple as that.
Well, here's the point, right? That's the point. Like if you say, okay, in order to make this national health service affordable, they need to reduce the quality of medical services. So the high class, top-notch medical services will not be available anymore. Then you'd have an issue in terms of freedom, maybe. But I don't think the Americans are even talking about this option. There will still, as you said, be the private option. And so in that case, how is it reducing your freedom that you get the basic for free? It just doesn't make sense. Would you be more free if you had to pay for the air you breathe? Like, would that increase your freedom that you have to pay for the air? I don't see how paying for anything can make you more free. And yes, obviously that's not socialism to have a healthcare option that is mandated by the government.
I think Medicare for all, which I mean we don't use that name in other places. It's Medicare in Australia. It's National Health Service in the UK.
Right.
China has a social security system that kind of has a safety net, but nothing is free in the hospitals here. You either pay insurance if you're working, or you pay cash if you're not. I'm now an expert on the Chinese medical system because I've just spent some time in it. But the fact is, it's not free, but it's very affordable. Yeah. And even the most serious of cases are. This is the biggest problem China has with internal consumption. Many people save up in case they get sick. Right. My mother and father-in-law have enough money in the bank to cover cancer and stuff like that, just in case that happens. So when Medicare for all, if it was ever introduced into China, or if it was just introduced for the old people, they would be able to spend that money, and that would help internal consumption. I think that's one great thing that China probably is looking at. They're pretty smart people here, but the government is probably looking at that already, saying, how do we free up the savings that people have kept just for this kind of eventuality? And Social Security is relatively new. The social medical insurance is relatively new. It's been in existence 20 or more years, but it's actually ramping up now. So the point where people of my age have got cover inside of their insurance system, they don't need to save money for that. But people my father-in-law's age don't, because they weren't in it when it was, it didn't exist when they were working as 14, 50-year-olds. So there's the issue. It's still a developing nation.
Yes. So like one system that is the Swiss system that actually does take away from your freedom, or it's a very polemic framing, but it does force you to make payments that you may not want to make, which is the Swiss system is you're forced to buy a private insurance. So you have to buy an insurance, and it's a political topic how much that costs, but it's quite a bit of money. And as long as you're not completely broke, if you're completely broke and unemployed and on social security aid, then the government also pays for your social insurance. But as soon as you have your own income, you have to pay for your healthcare insurance. And so that is, in a way, if you're 20 years old and healthy, you actually really don't need that insurance, and you have to pay it. So in a sense, you could say that takes away from the freedom. It makes total economic sense, because if everybody pays, it gets cheaper for everyone. If only the sick people and the unhealthy people pay, then the insurance premium will be much higher for everyone. So yes, in a way, that's socialist in the sense it outsources individual health risks to all of society. And I'm, of course, in favor of such a socialist system, because I think it's part of being human that when you're healthy and strong, you contribute to society, so that the poor and sick and unhealthy can benefit from that as well. That's what makes us humans. As opposed to tigers, which are very individualistic animals, not even wolves, right? So I see that point. You can organize it in various ways. As said, the British, they don't pay for it's covered by taxes, and the Swiss. But one thing that I want to say, and that I find very problematic in the Chinese insurance system, is that it kicks in from zero. So the first medical expense, you can immediately get it from your insurance, but once you cross a threshold of costs, then it stops. So it's like an upper limit of how much the insurance pays for you. The Swiss system is the opposite. It has a lower threshold. So the first 1,000, 2,000 US dollars of medical expense per year, you have to pay for yourself.
Yeah,
that gives you a huge incentive to avoid unnecessary medical treatment, because you have to pay for it for yourself. But if you have a serious illness that costs, like 50,000, 100,000 or more dollars or euros, then that's covered. So there's a lower limit. Below that, you pay for yourself, but there's no upper limit. So if you have like cancer or something that's really expensive to treat, then you have the insurance. So the insurance doesn't cover your daily expenses, because you don't need that, because you have your own income. but it covers you in case of a serious issue. And the Chinese is kind of opposite. So you have the insurance and it covers your daily expenses, which you could just pay for yourself. But once you have a really expensive disease, then it's not covered anymore. And yeah, I think
it's like a debit card. I wanted to raise this with Don's point. Don and I are kind of mates. We know each other online, never personally met, but he lives in Shenzhen and I live in Zhongshan. We're on opposite sides of the river. Don is like myself. I'm 66 years old. I'm not eligible for the Chinese insurance program. When I was working here, I was in it. And I collected quite a lot of money into it because it is like a debit card. If you don't use it, it just mounts up. And when I retired, I was given the option of leaving it in there or cashing it in, but I didn't plan to stay in China, so I cashed it in. It was 32,000 RMB. So that was quite a healthy sum of money. But what I did with it then was I locked it away. I don't pay for any insurance anywhere, but I've got 200,000 RMB, actually it's 300,000 RMB locked away in a term deposit that I can't touch without, and there's no penalty, but I lose the interest. It's not very much, 2% interest. I lose the interest on it if I claim it. So I have no plan on claiming it. It's 300,000 RMB, which is what, $40,000. And that will cover me for the worst eventuality of anything that can go wrong in my life. I've got enough money in my normal savings account for an appendectomy. I don't have enough for cancer. So that's what I've done. Rather than pay 8,000 US a year, I'm just put 300,000 away. I put 200,000 first, and then I added to it when I got a little bit more money. And that's it. Just stays there in the bank account. Don't touch it. That's it. That's the way I've done it, Don. I hope you could do the same one day.
But that's exactly the issue that you mentioned before, the social security, especially for retirees, for older people. That's definitely an issue that the Chinese need more reform and need new models. So
I've just been asked to provide more lighting, and I'm just commenting on this. Unfortunately, I can't. This is as light as it gets. I'm in a hotel room. You can see there's a light there. I've got all the lights on, and I've got the windows wide open. I can't get any more lighting. Final parting words, because we've run over the hour that we said we would go. Anything you want to add to it, and where can we find you? I know you're Harold in China on X. Is there anywhere else?
Yeah, yes, Harold in China on X. I have had a YouTube account, but I've never made any videos anymore in recent years. So just find me on X.
Are you on Douyin as well?
Yes, I've just restarted Douyin, which is l'iteration of Huhaiwan. So it's a Chinese name completely. It's not an English name. And so it's 来自瑞士的 Huhaiwan, which is my.
Can you write it into the comments?
Can I? I can write it into the chat. I'm on your StreamYard here. So I write it.
Put it up.
Yeah,
if someone made the comment that this guy's good on Douyin.
Oh, thank you.
They thought you were Swedish, but that's okay. They've corrected it.
That's fine. Yes. So that's a ratio. Yeah, I get around 10,000 views on average, sometimes a bit more for Douyin videos, but I'm still looking for direction. It's just short videos at the moment. So I'm not lecturing Chinese on Chinese politics. And so I'm going to see where I'm going there.
No, you can't lecture Chinese on politics. This is in the wrong. You put it into the private chat, so I'm just bringing it up there.
Yeah, please do.
And then I'll show it there. That's where you are on Douyin. So anybody who wants to follow up on Douyin and find out what Harold's opinions on everything except Chinese politics are, that's where to go.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually wanted to talk about child education and stuff like that. Should children go to Chinese school or international school? Where I'm strongly of the opinion, go to Chinese schools, because in 20 years, nobody will cry after the American universities anymore. The Chinese are catching up quickly and already release more research than American universities. So in 20 years from now, if you have young children, give them access to Chinese universities. That's far more important than to American universities. That's how I started, got a lot of views on that. But now people keep asking me about, is Switzerland still a neutral country and things like that, which,
Good question.
I wish it was, and I wish I could say it was, but unfortunately, I do admit that it's not exactly neutral anymore. So yeah, anyway, so these are some things.
I think we touched on that last time we spoke, because that was when I think it was the Russian money had been kind of seized by the Swiss banking system, something which, up until a few years ago, you would have said that's just impossible. That's never going to happen.
Yeah,
and now here we are. It's happening. Yeah. What are Douyin and Xiaohongshu? Someone says they're just social media sites in China. Little Red Book and Douyin, Xiaohongshu. Yeah. Anyway,
started Xiaohongshu.
No, neither have I. I stay away from Chinese media because I am political, and it's just not something they like. They'd be canceling me all the time, so I just stay away from it. So should we call it a day so you can go back to work and start beating your employees again round the head?
Yeah, I just see the comments here. It's exactly the same thing. So somebody talks about the game changer missile in from Russia, and I mean, I'm interested in these topics, but I just don't want to be the type of person who talks about everything, because I would just regurgitate what I hear from the Duran and from, like New Atlas and these channels that probably the commenter here also watches. So I wouldn't add much new thoughts to what they say. So I focus on China and on Chinese socialism and socialism in general. I think these are topics that I know a bit about that maybe others know less. So that's why I want to talk about these things.
Okay, cool. Well,
and yes, right or left does not matter. So if you want some final words for the streams, I don't care if you identify as a right winger or as a left winger. Just be honest about where in society you stand. And if you're like a working class person, think about what's good for the working class and not what's good for the owners of the companies that exploit you.
So yeah, that's very true. Best to try and avoid exploitation, and China seems to do that quite well. So
they're on a path, and it's good to push them. I think that's the one legitimate thing that foreign countries could have done and could do, like the ILO, International Labor Organization. They always, put the finger on where worker rights in China weren't up to par and where they should improve. And the Chinese take that very serious, because these are relevant criticisms. If you talk about Xinjiang and Tibet without actually acknowledging how the real situation in those regions are, then obviously your criticism will be laughed at, because it just is not relevant for Chinese to hear about don't do a genocide when you're not doing a genocide.
I've been to both regions now, and I can assure you there's no genocide, not even any oppression going on in either of those places. Let's leave it there on that happy note. But what you've just done is give me an idea for another chat in a couple of weeks or maybe a month's time, sometime maybe around Christmas time, about Chinese labor laws.
Ooh, okay. I get some time to rethink. Yes, no, but yeah, that's a good topic. Happy to talk again.
Cool. Well, I want to thank everybody. There's a couple of super chats there. Thank you, Trevor, and thank you for Kevin for the super chats, and everybody else. We got up to 150 viewers, which is quite good for the middle of the day. And thank you very much indeed, Harold in China, a Swiss expert. I think I called you German before, and I apologize. It's the second time I might have done that. But a Swiss expert on what's going on in China at the moment. And you can find him on that website, which you can see there, which is that Douyin. So you have to cut and paste that from the comment section if you don't read and write Chinese. But he's there on Chinese social media and on X, Harold in China, which I think was, Harold in China. But all one word, correct? Harold in China is one word on X.
In X, yes,
it's because you're Houthi Harold,
and for the Chinese for the English speaker, it's Harald. It's not the Harold with O. It's the German spelling. Yeah,
it's not my granddad's name. It's a German version of my granddad's name. There you go. There is a connection there. All right, everybody. Thank you very much. We're going to end it there and say goodbye from so a couple of comments about it raining. It's not. It's a beautiful, sunny, blue sky day here in Guangdong, and I'm in Guangzhou in a hotel room. And tomorrow night we'll be back home where I'll be reporting from the normal, well-lit studio. So thank